with other generations. So I want to tell you a little bit about my grandfather first. He was a high school French teacher in Brooklyn, New York. He was a linguist. He loved languages. He loved his students. He was also an activist with the American Labor Party. And the American Labor Party was first established to help get FDR into office. And so it was kind of a political front group because nobody really expected that an American Labor Party candidate would be elected, but it helped other candidates to become elected. And so what happened with my grandfather is that there was an instance of police brutality in the neighborhood where he lived in Brownsville, Brooklyn. There was an African-American man. He was 26 years old. His name was Henry Fields, and in broad daylight, he was killed by a police officer. He was a father of four, wasn't carrying any gun on him, and when I had heard about this vaguely growing up, but didn't know many details. I was excited to see my grandfather's name referenced in a book about the civil rights movement. Yes. And they called the Henry Fields case the Rodney King incident of its day. So it was the 10th incident of police brutality in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And so it really incited the entire neighborhood to a near riot. So my grandfather was called in the middle of the night. He went to the neighborhood to help quell the potential violence and organize a peaceful protest. Unfortunately, my grandfather died. So he was a teacher, and many people don't know that teachers in the McCarthy era were also persecuted. They were called reducators, so red educators. And the population of, there was the highest population of teachers persecuted in California, New York, and Pennsylvania. And so he was called in by the superintendent of schools of New York City, and he didn't know why he was being called in. And they said, we want to ask you about the Henry Fields incident. He thought that maybe he was going to be praised for his activism or his role. And so I don't know, that's just what I heard, that he didn't know what to expect. And so they were asking him details about the case. And then they accused him, because I found the actual transcripts, which were absolutely mind-boggling to read this. They started out in a really innocuous way, tell me about the case, thanks for coming, and then they said, so we heard that you were inciting, racist language, and he's like, no, actually, I was doing the opposite. And then all of a sudden, of course, they asked the question, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? They said he was also called in with another colleague, and they said, how is that relevant, of course, and eventually, my grandfather was never a member of the Communist Party, but the American Labor Party, there was about half of the American Labor Party members were communists, and I don't think he ever did answer that in the transcript. Anyway, my grandfather, at the age of 38, was going to mail some, in the midst of these questioning, these interrogations, he went to go mail some newsletters for the American Labor Party, and at the age of 38, outside of a post office, he dropped dead from a heart attack. So my father was only 7 years old at the time, and grew up, just with this feeling that his father was a hero of some sorts. He was wronged in a major way, but never quite understood at the age of 7 what happened. I grew up knowing even less than my father. My father kind of internalized this notion not to ask many questions, which was really common in the age of the McCarthy era, a lot of fear, not asking questions. I heard that there were pictures of my grandfather and his colleagues around the house which were scraped off of furniture, which were thrown away in case the FBI would visit the house, which was a common fear. His colleague, who didn't die, as my grandfather did, he was called, he appeared before Senator McCarthy himself years later, and then was fired as a teacher, blacklisted. And it was in the 1970s, actually, that all teachers who were let go during this time were then reinstated for the purposes of getting lifelong benefits and some sort of compensation for what happened to them, because it was clear that their performance as teachers and their political activism outside were not really related. So my father, Henry, at age 7, lost his father. Then he himself became very averse to becoming politically active. So even though he grew up in the 60s, he didn't go to anti-Vietnam protests. He was kind of scared that there was always the big brother watching him. I, in turn, rebelled against my father. I wanted to become very politically active. Without really knowing what it was about, at my college, joined the International Socialist Organization. Just wanted to do something. You know, we stood outside. I went to school in New York City. We stood outside in Harlem and sold socialist newspapers and talked to people about issues. Right now, I'm a political organizer at a union in San Francisco. It's called Local 21. Professional and technical engineers, Local 21. So we represent public sector employees who work for the city of San Francisco, either in hospitals or even engineers and architects who work for the Department of Public Works, stuff like that. So my job is to help certain candidates that would serve labor interests be elected into office, and also promote certain ballot measures that would be in the interests of unions, fight for or against different ballot measures. And so in some ways I think it parallels the work of the American Labor Party. I wanted to discuss just a little bit in the book also. I relate my personal story to that of other people who experienced something similar in the McCarthy era. So I interviewed Robert Miracle, the son of the Rosenbergs. Although the case of the Rosenbergs is much better known, there are certain parallels. He also lost his parents at a very young age, as my father did. Whereas my grandfather was not famous. The case of the Rosenbergs, of course, the Miracle boys had to grow up reading books and hearing accounts of their parents that in some ways they had to dispute throughout their lives. And he said that there was a book by Louis Nizer, The Implosion Conspiracy, where basically an author dedicates the thesis of his book is that his parents didn't love him, right? That they in some ways chose politics over their family. And I think that's actually, believe it or not, that's a common perception of people who live through this era, that by being so politically active and even in continuing in their activism despite knowing the ramifications for themselves, their families, perhaps losing their jobs, or in my grandfather's case, losing his life, and in the Rosenbergs' case, losing their lives, but in some ways by not turning in other people, by not naming names, that was somehow a choice to choose politics over their families. And that's something that he kind of had to battle with his whole life. But in honor of his parents, and it was actually in a settlement because he sued Nizer, and he sued authors who made inaccurate allegations about his parents, and the money that he received, he founded an organization called the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which he is now the director of. And his daughter, just relating the theme of generations, his daughter also works at the organization as a lawyer with her father. So again, in the family, the legacy has lived on. And I just want to bring one other case of a woman that I interviewed, a family friend, because when I started writing about the McCarthy era, you can imagine that different people, like different family friends, said, "Oh, my father was blacklisted," or "I know so-and-so who is blacklisted." So I think it's more common than we might think, or it's just a theme that we don't talk about as much. So I was excited to hear all these different people that I was connected with did have a connection to the McCarthy era. So this woman, Susan Pearlstein, who is a friend of my mother's, her father, he was a communist doctor named Hyman Warshall, and he established Health Insurance Plan of New York, which was one of the earliest forms of health insurance for the working class. And she told stories of growing up, sitting on the staircase after her bedtime and just watching these meetings of men that she admired so greatly, and they were talking about changing the world, and it all just seemed very exciting to her. So she would stay up past her bedtime and just watch these meetings. She was also in charge of watching out for the police. So she sat on the porch, and especially when there were strikes in the middle of the night of the Longshoremen's Union, her father would see people who were in violent altercations who came to the house for medical treatment. And so she would alert her father, oh, the police are here. She would also be in charge of when the FBI came to her house to say, my parents aren't home right now. So really just imagining what people live through and then how it might affect their psyche for the rest of their lives, just this internalized fear. And even now, she told me about her story. Then she said, I'm not sure I want you to publish it. And she had to think about it for a while. Some people didn't really even want to share their story. So the fear is really internalized, and then it's a question of, is it passed down to the next generation as well? Or if, as in my case and in others' case, I think we rebel against it and we say, oh, but we want to know everything, and kind of don't be so secretive, and we don't understand the need for secrecy about this issue. So Judith asked me to speak not only, I think those personal accounts are what I could speak best about or from the heart, but also relating the economic justice movements of the McCarthy era to what's going on today.
Before you get into that,
yes.
Could I share what happened to me?
I would love to hear it, yeah.
Yes. I was teaching, this is in the 50s. I was teaching junior high school in Los Angeles.
Yourself, please.
Ruth Chapin. And I was teaching a junior high school in Los Angeles, and my principal called me in and said he had gotten some kind of word from HUAC. I had also been active in a socialist group in college, and so they were asking me to resign. So I did resign, and I moved to Orange County, where I still live, and believe it or not, I found another junior high job in Brea, and again they followed me to Brea, and the superintendent called me in. His name was Jaster, and he said, "This is ridiculous." He says, "I have friends who are socialists. This is Orange County."
Really? Home of the Church Society.
Then. And so I didn't get fired, and there I am. I was living in Costa Mesa, traveling to Brea. The FBI did come to my door and follow me, wanted to see what I was doing, and I said, no, I've reformed. I'm just teaching school and raising a little girl. And so they left me alone. That was the end of the story. And then I met Ted, my husband. So I was very happy that I moved to Orange County.
Send a thank you note to the FBI.
Well, I think just building off of that, I'm actually not in a rush to talk about larger political movements. It reminds me of other people in the book that I interviewed. One family, Gordon Kahn. So you know the Hollywood 10 were the most famous actors and directors and producers who were blacklisted in the McCarthy era, but originally there was a list of 19, and so they got the name lesser known of the unfriendly 19. So after the first 10 were in court, there was a pause in the case because it was so controversial, and people like Judy Garland, E.B. White were speaking, out about what was happening to these people who were much loved, and so they put a stop to the case. And at that point, someone named Gordon Kahn, who was described by even his son as a B-list producer, he wasn't as well known. So he decided to flee the country. So he went to Mexico. He went to Guadalajara, Mexico. He brought his family. And so Tony Khan, who's now a radio announcer for the Boston Public Radio, WBUR, he grew up part of his childhood in Guadalajara, Mexico. So, and he's really funny. So he just tells stories about growing up in a. First, he said that in LA, his family actually celebrated Christmas. They were secular, and it was an American holiday for them. Then in Guadalajara, he felt so Jewish because people knew that he was Jewish, and he said that the first time he realized that he was Jewish was somebody cornered him and said, "You killed Jesus." K-A-H-N. So he went home and he said, "Is this true? You know what?" He asked his parents, and they said, "No, it's not true." And he said, he said, "Well, what does it mean to be Jewish?" And they said, "Well, there's somebody named Moses, and he had long, white hair and a beard." And so Tony describes hearing this and being comforted that he's like, "Okay, it reminded me of Santa Claus." So he felt better about being Jewish. And then he heard, and on Passover, one of his Jewish relatives visited from the United States to Mexico. And he was actually one of the founders of the Reform movement. And for the first time, they celebrated Passover. And so they were doing the tradition of dipping your finger in wine, and then some of the wine got all over on the white tablecloth. So he looked at the tablecloth and he thought of he said, "Oh, it's true. Like there's blood all over the table. Like we did kill Jesus." And then they started eating chopped liver, and he's like, "Oh, we're eating liver." Like he was just describing. He's really funny. So I really enjoyed hearing his story. His father, was very paranoid living in Mexico, and J. Edgar Hoover seemed to have really something against him. He was really like following him. He was determined to get him. And so there were newspaper articles in the Guadalajara newspaper, like saying there are communists living here, communists come to Mexico. And so that surprised me that even abroad there was a large population of expats. He was able to do some writing under a pen name from Mexico, and then he had his screenplays sold still in the United States. And then Tony Khan, his son, he said how he internalized that fear. Watching his father in some ways deteriorate. His father suffered from a heart attack at a young age, and Tony says that he still feels like, the carpet could be pulled out from underneath him at any moment. He watches his back. So it's quite sad, to see how that has affected their lives, but at the same time, everyone I interviewed, including my father, became a consumer advocate. Susan Pearlstein, the son of the communist doctor, founded an organization called Elders Share the Arts. So her organization was established so that older generations can share their life stories in a variety of ways, whether it be through dance or writing, talking to school children. And the reason that she established this organization was because she watched her father also deteriorate. He had done so much. But in some ways, her father, who was a communist, drew so much inspiration from the former Soviet Union. And when Khrushchev denounced Stalinist crimes, and American communists learned that the Soviet Union actually isn't this ideal. They're actually not good for Jewish people. They're not this this egalitarian society as they really idealized. Many people just lost. They lost their hope, they lost their idealism, and that's what happened to Susan's father. And she really suffered watching him go through this. And she thought that, maybe if he had people to talk to, if he had people who were interested in what was important to him, that wouldn't have happened. So she created that organization. So I guess my point is that even though the children of these persecuted activists, and in my mind heroes, internalized a lot of fear, watched their parents go through this, everyone did something that I felt was really incredible, and the common theme was to advocate for underdogs, was to tell people stories. My father was a columnist. People would call him up and say, "Oh, AT&T cheated me," and he'd write a story, and sometimes it helped solve the problem. Tony Khan, as the radio announcer. So let's see. There's a number of different directions I can go in right now. I just to get a feel, I'm really enjoying talking about the personal stories, and I would love to hear from some of you, or I could bring it to, in my mind, kind of tracing the labor movement from the time of my grandfather, and then talking about what's going on today. Are you guys interested in that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, but do you have a comment first?
I have two personal stories.
Okay.
Rochelle, you have to use a much louder voice.
I'm Rochelle Goldman. During the Second World War, I was volunteering for Russian War Relief in Chicago. And the FBI came to our home and asked my mother if she knew what I was doing. I was 17 years old. And she said, yes, I know what she's doing. She's supporting.
Oh, here? Okay. So the coffee.
Okay, thank you.